Hey everyone, Mike Schmitz here, and today I have a condensed version of the workshop that I did earlier this week titled Your PKM Stack, How to Use Obsidian to Create Consistently and Effortlessly. The gist of this workshop is about using Obsidian as the core of your PKM stack to power your creativity flywheel. Now, I happen to believe that everyone is creative, no matter if you are a full-time independent creator, a lawyer, an accountant, a doctor, a teacher, a student, a stay-at-home parent. Everyone can benefit from being able to think a little bit more creatively. So that's what the Creativity Flywheel is designed to do. It's designed to help you make more of the notes and ideas that go into your PKM system. This presentation also uses the exact same format I'll be using in my Obsidian University cohort. So as this video drops, that cohort will be starting in a couple of days. You can find out more information by going to obsidianuniversity.com/cohort. And if you're watching this after the cohort is concluded, you can sign up to be notified of the next one. But this video will give you a feel for how those workshops actually go so you can decide if the cohort is for you. Without further ado, here's the workshop. That kind of gets into the beginning of this. I want to talk about personal knowledge management, or PKM. I'm sure you probably are all kind of familiar with this term, but just so we've got a shared foundation here, PKM is actually a combination of a couple of different terms. It's personal knowledge and knowledge management. So personal knowledge is information that's important to you, but knowledge management actually comes from a corporate background. It's the way that you use information to support creative activities in an organization. When you think about PKM, it's how do I make sense of all of this stuff that I have to do, all this information that's bouncing around in my brain, right? And that's probably why you would come across an app like Obsidian, although that's not the only one. There are other apps that fall into this mythical PKM app category. And I say mythical because I really believe that there is not a perfect PKM app. And PKM actually is not an app. It's a philosophy, right? So you need a way to manage all of this personal information. I'm not arguing against that at all, but you're not going to do it all in one specific app. Just some examples of personal knowledge that you might need to manage. The tasks and projects that you are working on, the articles that you would read, all of the information that gets stuffed in a filing cabinet, receipts, documentation, manuals, all that kind of stuff. Events or meetings, appointments on your calendar, contacts, personal phone numbers, things like that, email addresses. And then the big one that I want to talk about here today is ideas. And this is the one that is fascinating to me because I think ideas come from how you view creativity. And maybe like me, a lot of you have this idea of creativity as like this spark of divine inspiration where you get like the whole plan just laid out in front of you. And now I know exactly what to do. And that happens great. But most of the time, that's not what happens. Most of the time, it's the result of a system which you have been working either intentionally or unintentionally. How many people here are familiar with Tiago Forte, Building a Second Brain? I like that book a lot. And in the book, he talks about how information is the fundamental building block of everything that you do. The point is that the information that you collect from the books that you read and the ideas that you develop, things like that, those are really like these little mental Lego bricks that you're collecting. And then I like to think of creativity as taking those Lego bricks and assembling them in new and interesting ways. So the pieces aren't original, right? But what you make out of them can be original. All right. And one of the ways that people have been doing this for literally hundreds of years is using a Commonplace book. Marcus Aurelius, Benjamin Franklin, Ryan Holiday all keep Commonplace books. Probably the most famous one, the earliest one that I could actually find like pictures of was Leonardo da Vinci had one. It's 3 separate notebooks where he just collected all the little bits and bobs of things. And that's what a Commonplace book is. It's a place to connect bits of information from other sources. There's the place for those little mental Lego bricks, right? And those knowledge assets can literally come from anywhere and they can be stored anywhere. So this Commonplace book does not need to be digital. Now, there are a lot of advantages with the digital Commonplace book, but there are also disadvantages, right? How many people here have used Evernote in the past? And if you have used Evernote, you probably made the same mistake I did. It's like, oh, this looks important. Oh, this looks important. Oh, this looks important. I'm going to clip it. I'm going to send it in there. And then Evernote developed this reputation a little bit unfairly as the Roach Motel because people could get stuff in there real easily, but it just sat there until they needed it. And then they went and found it. But most of the time it wasn't doing anything. And then they got frustrated with Evernote because they weren't getting the creative payoff they thought they were going to get. And then they went to find the next perfect PKM app that doesn't exist, right? So I want to change your thinking, hopefully, about that a little bit. Let's think about these as tools for our commonplace book. And I think that Obsidian really is the best digital commonplace book that is out there right now for a lot of different reasons, but you don't have to use Obsidian. I mean, I came from Roam Research. I like Obsidian better because it sits on those local plain text files. Craft is another one that people like to use. Notion is another one that people like to use. NVL, yep, exactly. Nick Milo talked about the archive back in the day. That was probably like the first version of these connected note-taking apps. But Obsidian is just that the team behind Obsidian is really hitting their stride right now. I think if you were to pick one, you had no idea where to start. That's the place that I would advise people to go because worst case scenario disappears tomorrow. You've got all those markdown based text files that you can move into literally any other app. It's not a proprietary format. Okay, so Obsidian is the best digital commonplace book, I believe, but only if you use it the right way. Okay, so what does that mean? It means we have to shift from this idea of note taking to note making, right? And I'll credit Nick Milo for this as well. First time I heard about this was in his Linking Your Thinking workshop. But note taking is probably what we're familiar with. This is where we just capture notes to an archive. They're in the filing cabinet if I ever need to go do something with those again. But those notes then are static and unchanging. And the way that we come in contact with them again is from the top down, where we have the thought and then we go find it, right? And at that point, maybe there's some additional information in that note that's helpful, but for the most part, it's not adding anything additional. It's something that is a historical archive. It has limited future value, right? But when you shift that and think about the things that are in your personal knowledge management system, all this information that's coming in and is going out, it's fluid, right? It's developing, it's ever changing, and you embrace this idea of note making, then you can get some pretty cool insights. And this is what I have done. So note making is kind of a new way to manage notes and ideas. And you can, with note making, kind of discover notes as you browse through your notes. Your notes will evolve over time. They're going to change. One of the things that I like to do is when I look at a note about a particular topic I was wrestling with, I'll add additional opinion notes and I'll make it better. And this allows us to stumble upon these things, not just from the top down after we've already had the thought, but they can kind of bubble up, right? So instead of feeling like your PKM is not working because the only time you ever get inspiration from it is when you've already had the inspiration and then you go find it, they can actually come from working with the notes and ideas that you have. And what that means is that instead of limited future value, there's infinite future value here because you really don't know what the value of the ideas is that you have until you have worked the system a little bit. Now, that system I call the Creativity Flywheel. And this is something that I really wrestled with. I said for a long time that I guess I'm just not creative. And I remember one specific moment where I used to really like writing songs on my guitar. And I would write a song and I would go out to eat and I would hear a song on the radio and I would realize that I took the chord progression or the melody line from something subconsciously. And I was like, oh man, I guess I can't create. Like those people can do it, but I can't come up with anything completely original. Right. And then I read Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon, and he talked about how if you want to create, really what you got to do is you got to collect the dots, and then you just connect the dots in ways that haven't been connected before. And then I'm like, aha, so this is a formula. It's a system. Well, the Creativity Flywheel is my system for working through the process of developing all those dots that I collect. There's 5 parts to this, and this is the meat of what we're going to go through today. The first part is capture, and I'm going to go through this quickly because you're probably all pretty familiar with this idea. I'm sure most of you have heard of getting things done. Raise your hand, I guess, if you have read that book. The idea of GTD, right? David Allen, one of the great ideas from that book. I don't really practice GTD by the book myself. But one of the things that I got from there was that
You should capture things because your brain is for having ideas, not for holding them, right? But then you can't just capture everything, or you can't just keep everything, because if you capture everything and you try to develop everything, then there's too much there. But at this first part, if you don't capture it, you have no options of developing it. So it is important that nothing falls through the cracks here. So we need to pay attention. We need to stay curious. We need to be looking for those things that resonate, right? That cause a reverberation in our soul. We need to capture, or we need to eliminate the friction during this phase. So when I am inspired by something, I want to capture it quickly. And if there's any friction in that capture phase, it means that I'm probably moving on to the next novel stimuli because the dopamine train has left the station and I'll forget about the thing, right? So eliminate the friction at this step. We'll add it back in later, but it'll be intentional friction. Emile Chartier said that nothing is more dangerous than an idea when it is the only one that you have. So at this phase, what we want is quantity, not necessarily quality. All right. So then after you've captured all this stuff, whether it be book notes or just ideas or tasks, whatever, the place that I capture most of that stuff that's not book notes, by the way, is drafts on my iPhone or also on my Apple Watch. If I'm out for a run, that's one of the places that ideas tend to come to me. So I'll capture something on my Apple Watch using the Siri dictation there. But once we do that, then we need to curate it. This is a very important step. All right. So to curate means to select, organize, and look after items in a collection. And this means that the things that actually end up in Obsidian is where I actually will develop these, are not going to be the same things that I capture. In fact, about 90% of what I capture does not make the cut. All right. But you are the curator of the museum of your mind. And it's important to put this space between the capture and the curate phase, because when you capture things, they all feel important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be capturing it. Right? Everything feels important the moment that you're thinking about it. But when you get some space from it, then you can start to see things a little bit more clearly. So I really think it's important to judge your ideas after you get some distance from them. The goal of the things that we're going to curate and put into the museum of our mind, by the way, is to have more signal and less noise. Okay, so if I am going to cut something that might be important, I'm going to trust that it's going to actually come back to me, right? If I am going to keep reading books on a topic because I'm interested in it, I'm going to come across these things more than once. And so I have this like 3 times rule. If I note, and I'm not like actually keeping records of when I have had these ideas or these thoughts, but if I recognize, I've had this thought before, I've had this idea before, that's usually the trigger. Like, okay, maybe there is something here, and then I'll curate it. But the important thing here is you can't keep everything. That's the promise of a lot of digital apps, is just dump it in there. It's all just text files. You can have millions of them. It doesn't matter. Well, it does matter because your brain can't actually do anything with all of those. So it's a tool for thought, but it is not going to do the thinking for you, regardless of how good the generative AI stuff gets, in my opinion. That you do have to have the ability to work with this stuff. So at this phase, we're adding friction back in. We took it out during capture, but we really want to add it in during this curate phase. And the question to ask here is this important enough to add to the collection? Going back to Tiago Forte in the book, Building a Second Brain, he said that in order to let the great ideas shine, you have to cut the merely good ones. This is really scary for a lot of people because they think that the idea that they have, they over-index on the value of that specific idea, and they don't really trust that they have a system that's going to give them more ideas consistently. So they have trouble letting go of those. But when you can trust your system and you know that you're going to consistently get more ideas, then that's where you become more ruthless with this cutting, because then it allows, just like pruning a bush or a tree, it allows the fruit that's there to get more healthy. All right, so that actually gets to the third step here, which is cultivate. Now, I believe that when it comes to developing ideas, all you can really do is provide some ideal conditions for your ideas and see what actually grows and develops. Right? You don't really know what you have when you have an idea. Right? You probably experienced this. You thought something was a really killer idea, and then you worked on this project for a long time and nobody cared, right? Or vice versa. You're like, oh, that's not really all that important. And then people are like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Right. So I think that really the whole idea of like the personal knowledge management stack is providing the ideal conditions for these ideas to develop before we know what we've got to work with. So I kind of view Obsidian and PKM specifically, but really the Obsidian in this phase as a greenhouse for my ideas, right? So I want to give my ideas the right conditions. And then I want to see what develops here. Now, I also believe that the really great ideas don't happen in an instant. They're actually developed over time, right? So again, this is a system, right? There's an input, then there's a process, and then there's an output. And this is kind of the process part right here. So in addition to just doing the day-to-day work here, if we really want to develop our ideas and make the most of what we got to work with, we want to schedule thinking time. This actually comes from The Road Less Stupid by Keith Cunningham. That's where I came across this concept of thinking time. And he basically said that I don't need to do more smart things. I need to do less dumb things, right? I need to quit swinging at bad pitches. And this happens with creativity as well, right? So at this phase, we're really just curious. We're looking at our ideas. We're not putting any pressure on, like, come on, you got to produce fruit. I'm counting on you, right? We're just, what is this thing really? And when you have this system that's consistently putting things into your system, this is where you can start to take your foot off the gas, right? When you recognize that everything up until this point is actually starting to work. John Steinbeck said that ideas are like rabbits. You get a couple, you learn how to handle them, and pretty soon you have a dozen, but you have to learn how to handle them first. Now, one of the things that I think helps with cultivating these ideas is this concept of atomic notes. Okay, so how many people have read Atomic Habits by James Clear? Very popular book. He had a definition of atomic there that I really liked at the beginning of that. It said atomic is tiny or minute, but it also means explosive power, right? So I took that concept and applied it to my notes in Obsidian. And I break them down into the smallest component pieces. And the reason for this is that when you're looking at a note or an idea, you need to instantly be able to tell, what is this thing, right? So this is where we're opening up the bags of all the Lego pieces and we're putting them all out on the table to see what we have to work with. Right. So, yep, Edward, you beat me to the punch. Note Composer is the thing that's going to allow you to do this. But when we break them all apart, then we can let our brain put them back together in new ways. And Note Composer actually creates the link back to the original notes. So that's cool. But really, the real value is in all the other additional links that we could create to that one specific piece. And this is how we play with our ideas, right? We have all these individual pieces, but we're not going to put a whole lot of pressure. We're not going to be too serious with any one of those Lego bricks. So let's take a look at Note Composer real quick. This is built into Obsidian, by the way. So if you go to the settings by clicking on the gear icon in the lower left, then go to Core Plugins, and you will see in this list Note Composer. So just make sure that that is toggled on. And then if that is, then you can start using this. Here's how you use it. Let's close our settings. I'm going to go to my note here from The Great Mental Models, Volume 1. I'm going to scroll to the section, the map is not the territory, and I'm going to highlight this text. Okay, so when we highlight this text, we'll have an option to use the Note Composer. All right, we'll right-click on this. And extracts current selection is how we use that feature. Now, Note Composer can do a couple other things, but this is the big one for me. Now, when you extract that current selection, it's going to ask, what do you want to title this, right? You can pick a new name for a note, then hit enter to create it. I'm just going to use that one. And then the text is replaced with a link. Now, in the settings, you can change it so it's not a link, it's actually transcluded. So you actually see the contents of that new note inside the original note if you want to do it that way. But that's kind of personal preference. All right. And then this is what the actual note looks like. All right. So all the contents from that note have now been stripped out into their own note. And that has been linked back to the original note. Now, what's also nice about this is that we can also see all of the linked and unlinked mentions for this note. So there's the link mention that I just made. There's a link from the original note that links to this atomic note. But there's also all these unlinked mentions, so we can add those links from the other notes real easily. We just go down there and we click the button to add those links. Okay, so this is kind of getting into really what we're doing at this point is we are building a map. Right now, there's the mental model that I just talked about here. The map is not the territory. Let me explain this a little bit because this was really powerful. I've actually got a YouTube video about this specific thing. But a map is essentially a representation of the territory. It can't be the territory because if it was a territory, it would be a one-to-one representation. It'd be as big as the territory in order to have all the information the territory has. It'd be useless, right? It's not a map. So a map is made by a cartographer who has decided these are the important things you need to know. And when you're looking at driving directions, that's easy. It's the major intersections, highways, points of interest, stuff like that. But when it comes to building your own mental maps, what is important? You get to decide, right? So I'm not building a second brain. I'm not building this stuff in Obsidian so that I can share this with somebody else. I'm doing this personally. It's selfish, right? So I am deciding the things that I go in here. What does this mean to me personally? All right. This kind of gets back to the whole idea of like the reading books, because I'm not just going to assume that, oh, GTD, David Allen's really successful. He obviously knows better than I do. That's gospel truth. I should just apply that system, right? That's not how it works. So one of the ways that I figure out how I think about these things is I develop a map of content. Now, again, credit to Nick Milo. I heard about this when I went through his Linking Your Thinking workshop. I was in workshop 3. And I like this idea of a map of content. It's kind of like a workbench for developing your thoughts on an idea. So here is that MOC that I mentioned earlier. This is one on the topic of habits. Now, at the very top, you'll see this page is where I will build out my codified thoughts on the topic of habits. This is where I kind of wrestled through things because I started with this Charles Duhigg model right here, which you've probably all seen. There's a cue, and then that triggers a routine, and then there's a reward, and then that kind of reinforces itself. But I never liked this. I didn't know why. I just knew that I don't feel comfortable thinking of myself as a rat in a cage. So then I was working through this MOC and I actually added that as an opinion note, right? So the problem with this model is that as soon as the cue is triggered, the routine happens automatically. You don't have a choice. It doesn't quite feel right. So then I read Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he adds another step here. Like, oh, this is starting to make more sense. He's got his 4 laws of behavior change where there is a temptation, and yeah, that could trigger it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to trigger it, right? So now I've got some agency in this. Well, what determines whether I give into that temptation or not? It's this BJ Fogg behavior model. So now I'm reading another book, Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. And this shows that the behavior, whether we follow through with that temptation or not, is based on our motivation, our ability, and the prompt that is being shown to us. So now we have some levers that we can pull, and we can start to figure out what can we do to create an environment where we follow through and take the action if it's something we want to do, or we add enough friction that we don't do the action if it's something we want to quit. Right? So here's this chart, and there's the action line, and the prompts succeed if we've got if the ability required is not very high. If it's easy to do, I guess our ability would be high in that case. We have a lot of ability. Or our motivation is high. And then we can construct an environment which either increases or decreases the motivation or increases or decreases the ability to follow through on the action. So now this is all starting to come together for me, right? So I added another opinion note here, right? So we can decrease the ability required, we can increase the motivation, and then we can flip this on the inverse if we want to stop doing a bad habit instead of try to build a good habit. I've got some additional resources below this. So this is kind of where I pulled the things onto the workbench. Like, what am I actually working with here? So we've got Atomic Habits, we've got Tiny Habits, the habit tracker. This is the thing in Obsidian where I track some of the habits that I'm trying to create. A link to the New Year Focus Calendar, which David Sparks and I do for the Focus podcast. That is something that I link to frequently when people ask me about habits. So I add that here. I also frequently link to the best habit tracking app for iOS article that I wrote for the Sweet Setup. So that's here as well. And then I came across this app by Jesse Anderson called Polar Habits, which was really interesting. It kind of flies in the face of the traditional don't break the chain idea. So all of that is here as I'm working through this stuff. And then the other thing that I do here, going back to the topic of atomic notes, I actually have an individual atomic note for every verse in the Bible in my vault. And the reason for that is so that I can pull in, like, these are transcluded notes here. Luke 4:16, Jesus had habits and customs, right? And you could make the argument, and this is kind of personal preference, if you want separate vaults for different things, that's fine. But I like the fact that my brain is kind of doing this anyways. It's applying these concepts across different domains. So I like having everything to be able to be linked to here. But you can see there's lots of Bible verses here. There's lots of opinion notes. And this now, each one of those notes is also linked to this MOC on habits. Now you can also set up aliases. So if you didn't want to call it MOC habits, you could just call it habits. And then in the linked and unlinked mentions, you would have all of the those words as well. In fact, you can see at the top here, I do have tags and aliases. The alias is habits. And those show up in the unlinked mentions. If I open this up, you'll see all the different places where it finds that word habits. Now, I'm not going to link all of those, obviously. That's an important thing here. I'm going to be specific and intentional about the ones that I'm going to create those bidirectional links for. And those bidirectional links are really powerful. They're a two-way street. It's not a link from note 1 to note 2. Because traditionally you couldn't get back to note 1 from note 2. But with one link between those two notes, now both of those show up and you can see the local graph up on the right. And sometimes I'll just surf through my notes and see different connections between things that I never got before. All right, but those opinion notes are really important. I want to come back to that for a second because Dawson Trotman said that thoughts disentangle themselves through lips and pencil tips. Basically, if you're trying to communicate an idea, you start to figure out what you think about it. But I would add to that also clicky keyboards. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've sat down and created an opinion note, and that's kind of the thing that helped it solidify for me. All right, then once we've cultivated these ideas, we kind of know what we've got to work with. Then we want to connect them. And this is the promise of apps like Obsidian. But I think this is a mistake that people make, is that they just dump everything in there and they start making connections and they feel like that's going to provide the insights. No, the connections have to be intentional, right? So we're going to look for those connections, those links. We're going to let our brain wander and experiment with things. We're going to compare our notes across different domains using that idea of syntopical reading. And we're going to prime the creative pump. Okay, so this is where the inspiration comes. And then the question to ask here is, how does this idea connect or relate to the other things that I've collected? Now, connecting is not just the links between the notes, although that is obviously one of the ways that you can connect things. So the way you do this in Obsidian is to use Command O to open up the quick switcher. I'm going to go to the James Clear note here. All right, hit enter to open the note. And then my local graph in the upper right, you can see that actually updates. So I use the local graph, not the big graph. The big graph kind of looks impressive, but it doesn't add any practical value, in my opinion. But the local graph shows all of the things that link to this note and that this note links to. So this is kind of how we can start surfing through these different notes. Okay, so let's click on the Atomic Habits note, for example, because this one actually does link to James Clear. All right, so here's my notes from Atomic Habits. And from here, we go to the 4 laws of behavior change. So we started at James Clear, we went to Atomic Habits. Now we're at the 4 laws of behavior change. Now we can go to the MOC on habits, right? You can kind of see how I've followed this chain of thought. I do this a lot also with like the sermon sketch notes stuff because I've kind of created my own cross-reference library with linking these things together. And I'll start because I'm looking at one thing and then I'll see the other verses that are linked. And I'll start to follow that chain. And then, oh, actually, there's this other connection here that I didn't see. So it's hard to really get the power of this visually, but if you start doing this, you'll get a lot of insight. So those links are really powerful, but they're not the only way that you can connect things. I mean, one of the things that people have done for a long time is they've used folders, right? So folders are a way to link things together, to organize things together. Tags and metadata are another way to do it. properties as well. Properties is new in Obsidian 1.4, but it's a very powerful feature and allows you to link things together based on status, for example. A home note is another way to link things together. This is kind of what my home note looks like. So I've got a picture at the top, and then I've got the tasks that are being pulled in there from Todoist for things that are due today and things that are due this week. And then I've got the things that are kind of currently being worked on. Those are all links on my home note there. And then obviously the maps of content are another way to link things together. It takes a little bit of effort to put those together, but anytime you're feeling stress from a lack of clarity on something, just start putting down your opinions on an MOC and the clarity will come. All right, so now we're at the last step, the fun one, create. This is the part that everyone wants to get to, but if you just sit down and try to create, this is the point where you've got an article you got to write and you're staring at the blank cursor and you have no idea where to start. And the more it blinks, the more stressed out you feel. Right. So, but when you do all the prep work and when you have a bank of ideas that have been cultivated and they're good ones, you've already curated them, you've connected them, you developed them, then creating actually becomes pretty easy. But the thing with creating here, and this is important for even for people who don't consider themselves creative, you must create. You have to have an output from your PKM system, right? You can have things that come in, but they have to come out as well. If you don't have an output, it's not a river, it's a reservoir, and an unattended reservoir actually becomes a cesspool, aka Roach Motel, aka most people's experience with Evernote. It's not Evernote's fault. It's our fault. We were holding it wrong. So with this, at this step, what we're doing is we're taking those mental Lego blocks and we're putting them back together. And if we leverage our opinion notes and our MOCs, we've basically got the instructions that come with the sets already created for us. And at this point, this is where we have to ask, what do I think about this? And this really cements the knowledge in our system. There's 3 levels of knowledge. The first level is having something. And we've all been here where we just dump stuff in the archive. Well, I've got it in case I need it later. And then there's level 2, which is knowing something. This is having the facts, and you can dig them up, even recall them even without having to go open up the filing cabinet. But we all know people who know something, they say something, but they don't actually do it, right? So that's the third level, is doing something. It's the application. So that is the key part here during the create phase. We have to actually do the act of creating. We have to follow through with this whole system. So you maybe at this point, you'd be like, yeah, Mike, your creativity flywheel makes sense. I'm going to do it. And then tomorrow, you'll sit down at the computer and you'll just try to start creating, and it's not going to work. Like, I've fallen into that trap myself. We got to come back to the basics. This is a system. There's no shortcuts here. And we can have this information. You can have the replay sorted somewhere. You can know it. Yeah, this is what the creativity flywheel is. But when you actually do it and you apply it, that's when you actually get the benefit of it. All right. So this is the 5-step creativity flywheel: capture, curate, cultivate, connect, and create. But like I said, this is a flywheel, right? So it actually gets easier the more that you do this. I had talked to Nathan Barry, the CEO of ConvertKit for Focus recently, and he talked about flywheels, and he had a couple of laws for flywheels. One was that each turn of the flywheel gets easier. And the second one is that each turn of the flywheel produces more output. So this is where it's going to take a little bit of effort to get this going. And that's going to be the point where a lot of people are like, this doesn't work, and they are going to give up on it. But once you get the wheel turning, that's when you really start to realize the benefit of this. And that is because with PKM, information needs to flow. I mentioned a river versus a reservoir. River has an input and an output. And a reservoir has an input, but there is no output. And then eventually the unattended reservoir, that becomes the cesspool. So your mind is like a water wheel. Water goes in, it creates motion, and then it leaves. When the flow stops, so does the wheel. The minute that there is not an output, the wheel's not turning. Now, I've said at the beginning, PKM is not an app. PKM is a system. So one of the things that I did, which was really, really helpful, is I audited all the different apps that I use on a regular basis. This was kind of inspired. My brain is kind of weird. I heard this story by Clayton Christensen, where they were working with these people who had a fast food restaurant and they were trying to sell more milkshakes. And the people who own the restaurant were trying to like improve the quality of the milkshakes so that people bought them more. And Clayton Christensen's firm comes in and they're interviewing people. And one of the questions they ask people who bought the milkshakes is, what job did you hire that milkshake to do? Because they realized half of the daily sales of the milkshakes were before 8 a.m. and the person who bought them was always alone. So the people who bought them, they said, we've got a long, boring drive to work. We don't want to be hungry at 10 a.m. They don't want something messy like a bagel, which is going to get seeds everywhere. Bananas are gone too quickly. Donuts are too messy. So they were really buying the milkshakes because they wanted something that was going to leave them feeling full and was going to occupy them during their commute. So that really got me thinking about all the different apps that I use. Because if you go to any application webpage, they'll give you a big list of all the features and all the ways that you can use it. Go look at the community plugins in Obsidian, and you'll be overwhelmed by the 1,000+ plugins that are in there and all the different ways that you can use it. But that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is, what value does this app add to me personally? So this is my PKM stack. I've got my personal tasks inside of Todoist. My work tasks are inside of Notion. My quick capture all happens in Drafts. Cron is the calendar app that I use for all of my events and appointments. Visual thinking happens in MindNode. All my sketch notes happen in GoodNotes. I use Readwise Reader for my Read It Later service and also my RSS feeds. And then the Obsidian app is where all the notes, the ideas, and the writing and the journaling and the reflection go. So this is actually kind of what all this looks like. And this is the part that I encourage people to think about this. How does stuff come into my system and how does stuff go out of my system? So email, meetings, Slack, messages, and people will give me things to do. And those will either be work tasks, personal tasks, or I'll have meetings or appointments that are generated from those. Okay. And then I've got all the idea stuff on the right, which is kind of what we talked about today, the mind maps, the sketch notes, the RSS feeds. Social is a source of inspiration for me because I've really curated the people that I follow there. And then that stuff actually goes through this creativity flywheel process. But basically everything except for the appointments and the work tasks goes into Obsidian for me at some point. And then it leaves Obsidian because I look at what I have in Obsidian in my daily notes when I'm journaling, and I will actually take all that stuff that's in there, including all the Todoist stuff that gets piped into my daily notes, and I will time block my day using a pen and paper. And that will also bring in the work tasks that I have to get done that day, the appointments that I have done that day. Everything gets time blocked on a piece of paper, and I identify 3 to 5 tasks that I'm going to try to get done that day, give every hour a job. That's what I work off of. I'm not constantly flipping back and forth between all these different apps. I'm not constantly responding to notifications on what I should be doing at any given moment, right? I am writing down the plan and I am working that plan.
I hope you found that workshop helpful, and I hope it inspired you to think about how you can start to be a little bit more creative using Obsidian. Now, if you need a little bit of help along the way, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's an Obsidian University cohort that is going to be starting right about the time this video drops. You can find out more information by going to obsidianuniversity.com/cohort. If the cohort has already started or we're in between cohorts, you can sign up to be notified of when the next one kicks off. Otherwise, I've got other resources over there like my Obsidian University Starter Vault, which is at obsidianuniversity.com/vault, or my email newsletter, which goes out every Monday and helps you be more productive or creative in Obsidian in just 10 minutes per week. You can sign up for that newsletter at obsidianuniversity.com/email.